Great. All right, well, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's lecture, Archaeological Adventures, Digging Up New Stories on the Quarter Place. My name is Cody Youngblood, and I'm the curator here at Patrick Henry's Red Hill. And this site is dedicated to historic preservation and education of Patrick Henry's Red Hill, his last home and burial place. Now, I'm very excited to see everyone here, and I hope you'll enjoy our presentation. Now, if you have any questions, please ask them in the chat box below, and we will answer them at the end of the lecture. Now, Archaeological Adventures is one of several educational talks held throughout the year as part of our Red Hill Rediscovered lecture series. And we're so grateful to our partners at Virginia Humanities for funding these programs. If you'd like to learn more about what programs we have coming up, please visit us online at redhill.org for a full schedule. Now, to get us started, I'd like to give you a brief overview of Red Hill so you can better understand what we're talking about. You probably all recognize this image, which shows the reconstructed Henry House in the center, along with our historic boxwood maze and several outbuildings. Now, Red Hill was home to Patrick Henry and his family from 1794 until 1799, when Patrick died here on June 6th of that year. From then, the property and its 2,900 acres was inherited by Henry's two sons, John and Edward, in 1815. 17 years later, the sons split the property, and Edward built a new house, with John remaining at Red Hill with about 1,000 acres. After John's death, the property fell to his son, William Wirt Henry, and then to his granddaughter, Lucy Gray Henry Harrison, who greatly expanded the property and remodeled the house. After the death of Lucy Harrison in 1944, the Patrick Henry Memorial Foundation purchased the site and set about restoring it to Henry's 18th century plantation. Now, however, throughout Red Hill's 150-year history, hundreds of enslaved and later free African Americans also lived here. They obviously did not live in the main house. Rather, they inhabited an approximately 100-acre stretch of land known as the Quarter Place. And here we see three formerly enslaved individuals, Harrison and his wife Millie on the left, and Albert Pennell on the right. Harrison and Millie lived on the Quarter Place, and we know Harrison was born enslaved by Patrick Henry and worked as a coachman to both Henry's son and grandson before emancipation. This photo of the couple was taken on the front steps of their home, which sources indicate was given to Harrison by Patrick Henry's grandson as a thank you for his years of dedicated, albeit forced, service. We believe this cabin was located near the current entrance of the Quarter Place. Now, Albert Pennell was born enslaved and later married a woman named Matilda Pennell, with whom he had 10 children. Pennell was photographed in this image at Red Hill in 1950 at 102 years old. Now here, this map of Red Hill gives you a good idea of some locations. You can see the Henry House and the boxwood maze again in the lower center part, with the visitor center and parking lot above. So here we are at the visitor center. Parking lot is right here. And the entrance to the Quarter Place is just at the edge of the parking lot right here. I think it's interesting that the visitor center is located in the middle of both the Henry House and the Quarter Place entrances. So visitors can see both from the visitor center. So of course it allows easy access to both sites. The Quarter Place is so called because of the slave quarters that used to exist here. And today, however, little remains above ground. The site has been used since prehistoric times and was likely inhabited by enslaved African Americans from the time of Richard Booker in the 1770s, more than 20 years before Patrick Henry's arrival. At the end of the half-mile trail lies the Quarter Place Cemetery, pictured here, and 147 burials exist on the site, with only one of these burials having an inscribed headstone, which you can see on the left right over here. Through archival research, 49 of these burials have been identified to date. And I'll talk more about this research of the cemetery a little bit later. When you visit the Quarter Place today, you'll see two buildings, one of which is seen here, and this is the original tobacco barn. This was built in the mid-19th century under the ownership of Patrick Henry's son, John. Under John's ownership, tobacco production increased, and structures like this tobacco barn were built along the Quarter Place to cure and process the cash crop. You'll also see this historic log cabin, which was moved to this location at the entrance of the Quarter Place Trail in 2004 to demonstrate what a typical slave quarter may have looked like at Red Hill. This cabin is now being used for exhibit space, where an exhibition on the African American history of Red Hill will be open in May of this year. Now, with that little bit of context in mind, we can now chart our work to uncover the archaeological data hidden underground. So in 1989, the first investigation of the Quarter Place was undertaken by Browning and Associates. Their goal was to locate structures extant at Red Hill during Patrick Henry's tenure and to identify the original location of buildings that had been moved. The survey consisted of archival research, visual inspection of the landscape, a probe survey, and a pulse induction meter, or a PIM survey. A probe is seen here on the bottom left, and it's essentially what it sounds like, using a tool to prick the ground in hopes of finding man-made material such as a building foundation. And a PIM is a fancy term for a type of metal detector that is used to detect metals in shallowly buried features. Through this survey, we uncovered an initial 122 graves in the Quarter Place Cemetery. And this count was believed at the time to be more than 90% accurate. But with the discovery of 147 total graves in 2019, the count was actually 83% accurate. Not bad considering the primitive nature of technology on hand. Also discovered was this large depression in the ground, believed at the time to be an ice house. You can see within the dotted line there, this descends about 10 or 12 feet into the earth. Several pieces of wood discovered at this site contained wire nails, which date them to after circa 1870, and led researchers to believe this ice house was built during the residency of Lucy Henry Harrison. More careful examination of the site in later years proved that this was not an ice house, rather it was the remains of an ordering pit used to cure tobacco. Through the next 11 years, the Quarter Place sat vacant until the foundation began plans to open it for public access. Pat McCloskey and Kimberly Gearhart of Longwood College prepared a report in May 2000 to provide recommendations to the foundation regarding the archaeological interpretation of the proposed Quarter Place Trail. This report analyzed 10 shovel test pits, also known as STPs, in 3 areas on and near the trail. Now, if you're wondering what a shovel test pit is, it's essentially what it sounds like. You dig a hole with a shovel to a predetermined diameter and depth, and this can help inform archaeologists of the density of artifacts in a certain area. And this map taken from the report shows the locations of each group of STPs. Pits A through D and K through O, which you can see right here, were dug to mitigate damage to archaeological resources that may have been affected by the creation of the trail entrance, while H through J were dug on the trail itself. The pits produced several artifacts helpful in dating activities which occurred on the Quarter Place. Pits A through G produced the majority of artifacts, including glass shards of a storage container, purple transfer printed stoneware from the 1820s, stoneware from the mid to late 18th century, and 2 prehistoric stone flakes made of rhyolite. This grouping of artifacts alone shows a near continuous use of the site from the days of pre-contact indigenous people through Patrick Henry's time and into the 19th century. Now, in archaeology, it's not only about analyzing artifacts, but it's also about analyzing the landscape, how it slopes and dips in ways that could be indicative of human activity. Based on the form of the landscape, McCloskey and Gearhart believed that the location photographed here could be a cemetery for the enslaved. Past archaeological surveys show patterns of placement, condition, and size of enslaved cemeteries in eastern North America are similar to those found at Red Hill. Located at the beginning of the Quarter Place Trail, which you can actually see the trail continuing into the cabin there at the back, this site is full of vinca minor, also known as periwinkle, which tends to grow in disturbed, loosened soil like that found in cemeteries. This perennial flower has guided researchers to many abandoned burial grounds that would have otherwise gone undetected. However, it's important to note that the presence of periwinkle alone does not always indicate a cemetery is also present. Shallow depressions in the ground were also found, which may indicate the setting of grave shafts. Now, grave shafts that contain coffins usually leave a more distinct and deeper depression in the ground due to the soil sinking once the coffin has collapsed. Grave shafts that do not contain coffins leave a shallower depression in the ground. The absence of coffins may also indicate that this is an earlier cemetery, which was abandoned when the Quarter Place Cemetery at the end of the trail was established. However, excavations still need to be done to confirm this. Another exciting discovery made in this report was the dating of these two slave quarters. Originally believed to be from Patrick Henry's era, these cabins were occupied by enslaved and later freed Blacks until the 1930s. The last documented resident of these cabins was named Jesse Cook. The cabins were originally built with brick chimneys, but by the time this photo was taken in the late 1940s, the chimneys had either collapsed or were removed and were replaced with interior stoves. So you can see the stove pipes coming out of the top of each cabin here. And you can also see the rubberoid roof, which had replaced the original wood shingled roof. After they were acquired by the Patrick Henry Memorial Foundation in 1944, the cabins were demolished and only their stone foundations remain, which you can see here. In 2000, McCloskey and Gearhart discovered several wire nails among these foundations, which helped to accurately date their construction. But how is this done? Well, nail-making techniques in the US can help archaeologists generally date buildings. The earliest nails were hand-wrought by a blacksmith using a hammer. You can see an example of that nail up on top in this diagram. And the earliest nails usually have round heads and an unevenly shaped body caused by that hammering. From the late 19th century, nails were made using different techniques, including cut from wires. So we can see a couple of these cut ones right here. Now, these were cut from iron plates rather than hammered. And you can also see that the ends are blunt rather than pointed, and the cut nails only taper on two opposing sides. So you can see here the left and the right, whereas the hand-wrought nails taper on all four sides. You can also see that in this diagram, so it tapers pretty evenly on each side of that nail. Because of the discovery of cut nails and the absence of hand-wrought nails, it can be assumed that these cabins likely do not predate the 19th century, and so were built during the tenure of Patrick Henry's son, John. And skipping ahead a few years, the foundation is able to acquire the Quarter Place from a logging company, and systematic archaeology coupled with interpretation can finally begin. The Longwood Institute of Archaeology at Longwood University conducted the most comprehensive mapping survey of the Quarter Place Cemetery to date. Under the direction of Dr. Brian Bates, students used LiDAR scan stations to produce 20,000 ground surface points, which were then used to produce a contour map, which I'll show you here in a moment. Analysis of the archaeological data helped determine a total of 147 graves within the cemetery and identified areas of archaeological importance that could be investigated in the future. Now, you might be asking, what is LiDAR and how can we create maps using it? Now, LiDAR stands for light detection and ranging, and it is a remote sensing method that uses light in the form of pulsed lasers to measure variable distances from the scanner to the Earth. These light pulses generate precise three-dimensional information about the shape of the Earth and its surface characteristics. The scanners you see here were actually used for this work in Longwood's mapping. The scanner at the left sends out about 50,000 pulses of laser light per second, generating millions of points on which to map a landscape. So again, to remind you of where we are, the yellow circle marks the Quarter Place Cemetery, about 3/4 of a mile from the Henry House, which you can see on the bottom right. All the white lines you see are contour lines, and these show the shape of the land, valleys, and hills. In steeper areas, the contour lines are closely spaced, and in flatter areas, they are far apart. So you can see that the cemetery is built on a bit of a steep hill right over here. And this is the map that was produced by archaeologists in 2019. You see the cemetery there at left with all 147 burials indicated. The abandoned roadbed is over here on the right, and the areas of archaeological importance are the 6 squares noted as well. the 5 squares. And these surround the roadbed, and these features were considered to be potentially related to one another since the road descends down the hill towards the 5 features. We'll come back to those in a moment. And here's a closer look at the cemetery. Now, it's important to remember that of these 147 graves, only one has an engraved headstone, that of Matilda Pennell, who died in 1923. You can see she's buried right here. The other 146 were variously marked with a headstone, or a headstone and a footstone, or no headstone at all. And each of these stones appear to be local, unmodified field stones, which was a common practice in enslaved cemeteries. You can see an example of one of those stones here. It's a very simple gray stone, probably taken from a nearby riverbed or even from the bank on which this cemetery sits. And these are the areas of archaeological interest. So the 5 sites within these boxes are terraced, and they're suggestive of possible structure locations with subfloor pits. So the terracing goes down a bit of a step format, and sometimes building like slave quarters would be equipped with these subfloor pits that you could access in the center of the building to store your cold items or any other pieces you might need that needed to be held in an underground cooler temperature. Now, only archaeological investigation can prove whether these are actual man-made features, and if so, what period they date to. And we hope to investigate these features within the next few years. The most recent work completed on the quarter place was executed again by the Longwood Institute of Archaeology under Brian Bates. This work went beyond mapping and excavated several visible features along the trail within a limited survey area. 5 of these features, including stone foundations of a structure, possible grave shafts, and a circular depression, were chosen for follow-up investigation with an aim to answer 4 primary research questions. So number 1, what function did the structure associated with the stone foundation serve? Number 2, when was the structure erected and how long was it occupied? Number 3, are the oblong depressions southeast of the structure grave shafts? And number 4, what is the large circular depression northwest of the structure? And is it a cultural feature? And if so, what function did it serve? So you can see here the dotted line marks the quarter place trail, with the yellow rectangle in the center indicating the survey area. So we've got the important visible landmarks on the site as well, from the 2 slave quarters I mentioned before, which are now foundations, the 1850s tobacco barn, the ordering pit, and of course, the cemetery at the end of this trail. Here's a zoomed in version of the survey area. You can see it begins and ends between 2 landmark features, which I've just mentioned, the 19th century tobacco barn to the east and the ordering pit to the west. A pedestrian survey resulted in the identification of 3 main areas of interest. Area 1 here in the red, Area 2 here with the green, and Area 3, which is these long blue lines here. Now these Area 1 and Area 2 are considered archaeological resources, whereas Area 3 is considered an architectural resource because we assume it to be an abandoned roadbed. Now, Area 1 consists of a stone foundation on the southern side of the trail, which is marked with the structure right here. And archaeologists also discovered a rectangular stone foundation measuring about 4 by 5 meters with the base of a stone chimney on the eastern wall. These 2 aerial photos show the structure standing in 1937, but if you look at the one on the right, you'll notice it's been removed sometime between then and 1954, when the second photo was taken. And these aerial photographs have helped us to understand the locations of structures at Red Hill through time, prior to the restoration of the 1950s, of course. For example, in this 1937 aerial, we can see just how much land was cleared around the site and how much vegetation has since encroached over 86 years later. Some important areas to note here. We have the Henry House, which had already burned and was in ruins at this time. and what is today the modern entrance to the Quarter Place Trail. So when you visit Red Hill, you'll still come down this main road on the right, that is Red Hill Road, and the visitor center sits in this plot of cleared land right here. A closer look at this photo also reveals several buildings which have been lost as a result of the foundation's restoration. The two slave quarters we saw earlier were located here, still standing at this time, as well as two large plantation buildings located where our flagpoles are today, and the possible original site of the coachman's cabin. This cabin is where Harrison and his wife Millie may have lived, and during the restoration, this building was dismantled, moved, and rebuilt at its current location south of the Henry House. As a side note, the location of the cabin today has since been deemed inaccurate to Patrick Henry's era. However, oral histories from the Henry family did place a building at this site until it was demolished around 1911. And it's likely the building was actually constructed under Patrick's son ownership in the 1800s. And finally, we're back to our mystery stone foundation seen right here. Also see the result of LiDAR scanning of this area. So this has also confirmed the presence of that stone foundation. So it's this little blip right here in the map. You can also see we've noted where the roadbed travels. If you look closely, there's little indentations, which may indicate that roadbed having once existed. And even where there aren't forms marked, so there's something here that could be investigated and some other little blips that could be structures that, of course, no longer stand today. Now, 9 square test units were then dug around the stone foundation in order to recover artifacts that could aid in the building's interpretation of the building's function and chronology. Test units yielded 320 artifacts, with most of them being glass shards and ceramic sherds, classified as having functions related to the kitchen. These images show a small sample of those artifacts. So you can see we've got some more great nails. This one has been a cut nail. We've got the wire nail, which is a bit later, and wire nails are, of course, still used today. Quartzite flake, probably dating from the prehistoric era. Other wonderful kinds of glass vessels, mirror glass, and pieces of pottery. Now, we're able to determine, using this data, that in conjunction with the functions of buildings already known at Red Hill, that this building likely served a domestic function, such as a dwelling that housed enslaved or free plantation workers. And one of our research questions concerned a large circular depression located northwest of the stone foundation, which is what we just discussed. A single trench was dug to get a better idea of what was there. So you can see here, once the first few inches of topsoil were removed, we found a semicircular soil stain, which is denoted here by this dotted line. 2 layers were discovered here. One, which was filled with 19th and 20th century artifacts, which was over a second thin layer of possibly heat-reddened earth. 127 artifacts were recovered from this trench, with over half of the artifacts being glass that belonged to hollow vessels. The assemblage also contained ceramic sherds, nails, leather, window pane glass, shotgun primer caps, and other metal fragments. Based on this data, we determined that 64% of the artifacts collected served functions related to the kitchen. The extreme clarity and uniform thickness of the glass collected suggests that much of this glass was machine-made, post-dating 1905. Also, because most of the artifacts span the late 18th century into 1950, it's likely that this feature dates to the early 20th century or later. So if we were to interpret this feature, we can say that it was likely a trash or a refuse pit. It's also possible that people residing in the nearby building atop the stone foundation during its later occupation threw household trash across the trail into this pit. Area 2 was found because of several depressions in the ground, with an assumption that these depressions may be grave shafts. Trenches were excavated perpendicular to the orientation of each depression to look for the edges of these shafts. From this work, a total of 3 grave shafts were identified. And you can see that the grave shafts are indicated by the white dotted lines. Notice particularly in this photo, the difference in soil color where the shaft is located. Now, to a regular person, they may not notice this, but of course, to an archaeologist, they're able to discern the difference in color between these two types of soil. And the lighter color soil indicates in this case that the earth has been disturbed, probably through digging a grave shaft and then backfilling it to make the earth flat again. And from these trenches, 6 artifacts were collected, including the corroded handle of a Smith & Wesson Model 1 revolver, which is probably the more unusual artifacts that we found here. You can see what the whole gun looked like here on the right. The distal end of a human tibia, which is a piece of lower leg bone from a human, was also discovered, but that was left in place. Archaeologists believe that the bone may have been displaced from a separate grave by the roots of a nearby fallen tree. So that gives you a good idea of what Red Hill has done in the past. But looking for the future, coming up in 2023, we have our staff archaeologist who's set to work on a couple of the buildings you see here in this 1940s photograph. The building on the left is, we believe, a servant's quarter, and the building on the right is part of an ice house. You can also see just on the further edge, there was also probably a garden shed or a smaller other dependency that's just next to this servant's cabin. Now, we think that before the servant's cabin was built, there was some kind of kitchen that may have been on this site that burned around 1928. And we're hoping that because of this, as a result of this excavation, we're able to find out more about the lives of Black domestic servants that lived here in the late 19th into the mid 20th century. And of course, if this really interests you, if you're a big archaeology nerd and want to do some digging, we are always looking for volunteers. And if you're interested, you can go to our website, redhill.org/archaeology, to get a good sense of the schedule, what we're doing. And the great thing is archaeologists can do a couple different jobs. If you like to be out in the heat in the summer, finding artifacts in the dirt, you can work directly with our archaeologists to do that. Or if you'd rather sit back, relax, and wash artifacts in the lab, we'll have opportunities for that into the winter time. Now, I really hope you've enjoyed this lecture. And once again, thank you to Virginia Humanities for being our partners in funding this. And if there's any questions, I can get to answering some of those right now. As always, feel free to type them into the chat box, and I will do my best to answer them. So it looks like we already have one here. The question is, how much has the Quarter Place landscape changed since the time of people living there, and how does that affect the archaeology? That's a great question. The Quarter Place is really interesting because it's changed a lot since, we could start with prehistoric, or let's just say since the colonial era. So we know that Patrick Henry enslaved about 67 people by the time of his death in 1799. And of course, to house all those enslaved persons, we needed a good amount of slave quarters, along with domestic buildings, so kitchens, ice houses, and then that's in addition to the plantation buildings that we would have gotten, the tobacco barns, the ordering pits, things like that. And as you've seen already, most of those structures no longer exist. Probably from people moving away, structures get abandoned, they fall down, they get lost over time. So yes, the Quarter Place has changed significantly over time. And because those structures have been lost, archaeology is the only way to better understand what was actually at the Quarter Place and to understand the stories of people who lived there, because that's really what this is about. We're not doing it just to find where this building was. We're doing it to tell the stories of folks whose stories have never been told because they've been lost to the earth. Another good question here. Has any of the archaeology work been published, and is it available? Unfortunately, because our work has been very much in the early stages of research, we haven't published anything just yet, but I know within the coming years, as we do some more excavations and get a better understanding of the Quarter Place history, well, we can certainly get some published resources out there for the public. Are the parts of the plantation that was split up a part of this work, specifically Winston on the Stanton? That's a great question. So in case you don't know, Winston on the Stanton was created as a result of John and his brother Edward Winston splitting up Red Hill in the 1830s. So John stayed at Red Hill, lived in his father's house, but Edward went a couple miles down the road to start his new plantation, which he named Winston-on-the-Stanton. And of course, that gets its name from the Stanton River. That is currently a privately owned area. Sometimes it's used for logging, but it is not owned by Red Hill. So all this work that we've just discussed has been specific to Red Hill and the quartered place here. All right, where was the quartered place located in relation to adjacent property owners during Patrick Henry's tenure? So it's an interesting question because the quartered place was included in Patrick's large 2,900-acre property. And that property extended into both Charlotte and Campbell counties. And we think because the Henry house is located so close to the quartered place, that the quartered place would be pretty central within that large plot of land. That does obviously change over time because when we get into the ownership of the property in the 20th century, Lucy Henry Harrison, she owns her bit of land with the original Red Hill house, but the quartered place is then owned by her sister, Elizabeth Lyons. So she has a different house, different property, and that more specifically shows the end of the Red Hill plantation at that time because the other areas that were not owned by the Henrys had been sold off. Is there a map that shows the specific boundaries of Red Hill? Yes, we do have those maps. If you're really adventurous, you can go to the clerk of the circuit court in Charlotte County, and they'll have what we call a plat map. And those plat maps are created by surveyors, so we can understand for tax purposes exactly where the property of each landholder begins and ends. We do also have those maps in our collection at Red Hill, so if you'd like to contact any of us, we can certainly give you access to those maps. A number of the graves have been identified, correct? Yes. Right now, we've identified the names of 49 of the 147 graves. And how have specific or more generally graves been associated with lists of the enslaved? So it's an interesting question because we have Patrick Henry's inventory that lists the names of the enslaved who are living, but that doesn't really quite help us on who died here and who was buried here. So that goes a little bit further than archaeology, and that goes into the archives and the documentary sources. For the early years, sometimes in account books or other early death records, sometimes tax records, it will say when an enslaved person died. And we can assume that if they did die while they were living at Red Hill, they're probably buried at Red Hill. As tax records evolve and death certificates start to become a mandated part of the court system, we have death certificates that list, so-and-so Pinnell, so-and-so Britton died at this age, and it will also list their place of burial at Red Hill. So once again, we can assume if they're buried at Red Hill and they are of African-American descent, they are most likely buried in the quartered place cemetery. All right. Everyone had great questions here. I'm glad we're enjoying the presentation. If you have any more, feel free to type them into the chat box. All right. Were there churches on Red Hill? So right now we don't know, we don't think that there were any churches at Red Hill. From a lot of our records, we know most of the freed Black members of churches were probably buried at Mount Calvary Baptist Church, which is the closest church to Red Hill. There, of course, are exceptions to that, but there's no specific church that was at the Red Hill property. All right. Well, I thank everyone very much for this great lecture. And I really hope we can see you again at another Red Hill Rediscovered event. If you have any other questions, feel free to shoot us an email or visit us, of course. All right. Thank you again, everyone.